just touching on what Mark, and I'll make the point, and this is sort of touching on what Mark mentioned earlier around this plan is not just a vision, and it's not just 5 planning principles. How we see this plan rolling out is that we, based under these 5 themes, that there will be a set of objectives for each theme. There will be a master plan or a spatial sort of representation of some of the things that we're trying to deliver through each of these themes. But importantly, there's going to be specific actions associated with each of the themes, and implementation plan. And I'll make the point now around an implementation plan is the way that a place plan works best is if that there is ownership over the implementation of this plan, both within council and the different groups of council, but also within the different community groups and community members. There are things that council can and will do in terms of, for example, amending the planning framework to facilitate some of the outcomes that are some of the actions, that are outlined in this plan. But there's certain actions and implementation that we'll be handing over to the community to take forward. So we aren't at a point yet where we've got these actions and an implementation plan, but as we get to this next stage of consultation in a few weeks' time is when we're going to start to really get into the detail about what are the actions, who's responsible, and how's it going to be implemented, but also then start to, as I said earlier, put some performance indicators or some measurables around some of these actions so that we can continually monitor the success or otherwise of this plan. And if we're not achieving what we're setting out to achieve, we want to go back periodically and review and say, okay, why haven't we achieved this and what can we do to change that? But I do want to stress the point that for a place plan to be successful, we don't want people just expecting that council will deliver everything that comes out of this plan, because like a lot of the plans that have gone before this one, you'll probably be waiting a really long time for that to occur. So we'll be doing what we can do, but a lot of it will be for the industry and for the community to take over and deliver on some of these outcomes. So again, it is about all of these aspects coming into a place plan, but then looking at how we deliver that, what the model is to actually deliver that. So before I jump into some of the analysis, does anyone got anyone want to jump in with any questions before I get on to the next stage? And the 5-second silence rule means you all love what I've presented so far. Okay, so for those of you who've been in the first workshop, you would have seen some of this, and what we've tried to do is adapt it to include and to incorporate some of the feedback we've received. So some of the things that the community were aware of that we weren't aware of. So we've tried to start to incorporate the community's feedback into the analysis for Robertson. So look, starting with the zoning plan, and I'll try to get through this stuff pretty quickly because we have been through a large parts of this in the previous consultation sessions. But looking at some of the established precincts for Robertson, so we've got the established sort of civic precinct, for want of a better word, where we've got the School of Arts and the school. We've got this existing community and social precinct where we have the sports fields, the skate park, the men's shed, the CTC building, as well as some fairly diverse sort of food and beverage and entertainment offerings along the main street, which for a village of this size, it's quite a diverse range of sort of food and beverage and entertainment offerings along the main street. We also looked at what that means in terms of, I guess, pedestrian movements and an activity area along the street. And if you look at it at a map like this, it looks like the easiest town or village in the world to plan. It's a nice, compact, fairly permeable village. It looks very walkable. but for those of you who know Robertson and the topography and some of the other issues, it's certainly not as easy as what a map like this makes it seem. And part of that is to do with some of the constraints. So we know the village is dissected by a number of creeks, and the flooding, there's areas that are flood liable associated with those water bodies. We know the topography of the village creates some significant limitations in terms of mobility. It creates some significant opportunities in terms of views and things like that. But in terms of pedestrian and active transport mobility, it creates a real barrier. And similarly, the transport corridors that dissect the town. So we've got the Illawarra Highway and a rail line, which provide real barriers for the town centre. You can see in the photo on the left-hand side of the screen, not only have we got a highway that dissects town, some of the embankments either side of the main street and that topography are real barriers to mobility. I struggle to get up and down some of these hills, and I'd like to think myself as relatively fit and healthy. So anyone with any form of mobility impairment will really struggle in some of these areas. We also started to look at what is commonly referred to as the blue and green grid. So the open space networks, the water bodies, the vegetation corridors, and the role that plays, not just in the character. I mean, they have a huge impact in relation to the character of Robertson, but also the hydrological functions or their environmental or biodiversity functions. But certainly, if you look at some of these photos, they also play a significant role in contributing to the character of the village. We've also looked at some of the movement networks. This is looking at some of the existing infrastructure. There is relatively limited pedestrian infrastructure. There are cycleways that run on either side of Hoddle Street, which is great, but there are limitations in terms of pedestrian infrastructure. We looked at some of the real key attractors within the village, and we tested some of this with the community last time. Obviously, the school is a significant attractor. Every morning at 9 o'clock and afternoon at 3 o'clock, there are significant amounts of people coming in and out of the school. We've got some of these areas up along the eastern part of the street. We've got these activity nodes as well as the open space areas. And what that relates to in terms of movement, we've got high volumes of pedestrian movements moving east-west along the street, some pedestrian desire lines to cross Hoddle Street, but as we've all seen on site, there's limitations in terms of existing sort of crossing points. There are a number of crossing points throughout the street. Obviously a signalised crossing out the front of the school, which is perfectly appropriately located given the amount of people coming to and from the school. And there are some less formal crossings up near the bus stop and the IGA, but between the two, there's very limited opportunities to cross Hoddle Street. And if you stand on the street for more than a few minutes, you'll watch people take their lives into their hand trying to play Frogger to get across the road. And again, where we have this pedestrian activity area and what looks like a fairly walkable centre, but there are these significant limitations in terms of both infrastructure, crossing of the highway and the topography. And look, this is a really good example of some of the limitations in terms of the topography. So this is a section taken from out the front of the Robertson pub. You can see either side of what is a really wide pavement area for the road. Not only is it a really wide area to cross, the fact that the road is sunken down below the ground level of the buildings either side. So there's quite a steep embankment. at this point here, there are stairs, but they sort of the stairs occur periodically. There's areas where it's just a fairly steep embankment to get across the street. So it's a real barrier to pedestrian mobility. And even, so this is looking down in front of the CTC building. Even in an area like here, we have these really deep gutters, as well as, and this image doesn't do it justice, on the southern side of the street, that is quite a steep embankment down to what is a really deep gutter. So again, for anyone with any sort of mobility impairment, it's a really difficult place to cross the street. And then you've got to deal with a 4-lane, 2 parking lanes and 2 vehicle lanes of a highway. I think that one's just a duplicate of what I've shown before. We've also started to look at local character and some of the things that contribute to local character. So looking at some of the contributory buildings, there is some existing heritage items, but also some of the contributory landscape areas. For me, one of the defining characteristics of Robertson is no matter where you look, you are seeing significant mature vegetation. It is one of the greenest villages I have ever seen. I don't think you can look in any direction from any point and not see mature vegetation over the top of the buildings. So we wanted to start to, I guess, pick some of this up in the analysis. We also looked at views and the impact that views have on the character of the village. There are, and again, this is where some of the things like the topography really have an influence over the character of an area, because you've got a lot of areas where you have these long distance views out to the rural landscapes and the natural areas, really providing that that connection to nature and that connection to the rural landscape, which really contributes to the character of the village. As well as some of these shorter distance view corridors, and these view corridors along the streets, where you've got these tree-lined streets and these long distance views along the grid pattern streets, really sort of add to the character of the village. But also, when we're talking about views, it's not just about these long distance views out to the landscape. It's often about where the view terminates, and looking at some of these important views that terminate at buildings. So the cheese factory is a really good example, where you've got a long distance view along the main street that terminates in the cheese factory, which really adds to that sort of country village character of the village, as well as views that terminate in the train station, for example. And as well as some of those views that terminate in vegetation. Again, I spoke earlier about the one of the defining characteristics of Robertson being these views towards vegetation. And in most streets, your views either terminate, either have these long distance views out to the rural landscapes, or the short distance views to mature vegetation. As well as some of these sort of important view corridors through to the open space areas. And then in terms of the character, we also started to look at the built form and the role built form plays in relation to the character of the village. So looking at some of the setbacks and how the buildings respond to the street. So looking at where we have what we call active street edges. So that might include outdoor dining, or it might include sort of a fine grain retail edge that really activates the street through the built form. So there is this area around from the pharmacy down to the pub, for example, that has primarily a strip of fairly active edges, to areas around the civic precinct, for example, which, while there are points of activity there, the way the built form responds to the street isn't about creating an active edge. And then down near the Doctors and Pizzas in the Mist, there are some still active, but what I'd say is less active or moderately active street edges down around that area. We also looked at things like building heights. and the role they play in setting a character for the centre. So as most people know, Robertson is a predominantly single story village, but there are these areas that are either two-story buildings, or so the areas in purple. So these two buildings here are both two-story buildings. There's a two-story building in the center of the street, as well as some of these larger buildings like the shack that is a single-story building, but is sort of that 7 to 10 meters height. So it's at a two-story building height, but a single-story building. And again, just looking at what that means in terms of a section, it's not uncommon for a sort of country village to have the two-story pub on the hill on a prominent corner. So these sorts of building heights and the street edge can really play a role in setting the focal point for the centre and having that defined characteristic of a main street. And we also start to see, when you look at some of these things, when you look at where the active edges are, where some of those building heights are, whether you start to see a natural focal point for the village. I think we've spoken in a lot through the consultation session so far, and it's been brought up today as well, is that currently we have this really elongated centre, and there is a need to create a more defined focal point, and you start to see a more defined focal point around from the pharmacy down to Moonacres and beyond, and to a lesser extent over where Peter in the Mist and the doctors are as well. So before I start to jump into some of the solutions that we're thinking, certainly happy to take any feedback if we've missed anything, if we've got things wrong. That is still a work in progress, and we're still sort of adapting the analysis as we go, but certainly happy to take any feedback before we jump into some of the ideas that we're starting to think about. Okay, all right. Again, 5 seconds.
Sorry, we've got a hand up from Mark.
Oh, too late, Mark. Sorry, we waited longer than 5 seconds.
5 second rule, eh?
Yeah.
Just quickly, Michael, I think it's a great plan. I think all the work you've done is amazing, very thorough. But we've got to take into account things that are in the pipeline now by private developers. I noticed the Robertson machinery place has now been bought by somebody who plans to put a rather large piece of infrastructure in there, which is really tourist orientated by the sound of it, and it could make a lot of difference to where the place of Robertson is, and perhaps that should be taken into account when considering the other factors that you've mentioned. I don't know if a DA has been lodged in respect of that, but I understand that it won't be long if it hasn't.
Look, I'm certainly not aware that a DA has been lodged. I'm loosely familiar with the sort of current thinking for the site. Yeah, and you're right. We do need to, can't just pretend that things aren't happening in the background. What you've seen so far is sort of a snapshot of the current state. So that analysis that we just stepped through was looking at, okay, what currently happens in Robertson, what currently exists. The next few slides will start to go back into looking at the future again.
Okay.
So again, I just want to stress before I start to show you some things on a map that what I'm about to show you, we'll look at these different themes again. We're looking at only one aspect of these things, what we can start to present spatially, but that is not all, or that's not the be all and end all of what will be in this plan. A lot of the things that will come out of this plan might not be shown spatially. Some of them might be activities or events or whatever it might be, but certain things we can show spatially and certain things we can't. But there will be a whole series of actions and that implementation plan for each of these themes. So these are just some initial ideas. Certainly don't take it as the final, and certainly don't take it as that holistic plan that we're trying to deliver. So in terms of movement, so we spoke about some of the challenges earlier around movement, particularly around Hoddle Street and the barrier that it creates. We've been working really closely with the Transport for New South Wales about whether or not we can start to introduce additional north-south crossing points of Hoddle Street. They are certainly supportive of improving pedestrian mobility across Hoddle Street. What we think is an appropriate solution, again, the other thing we spoke about earlier when we looked at the topography is, even with a crossing point, some of these areas just aren't practical crossing points because of the topography or the embankments on the side of the road, for example. So what we're really wanting to do is to improve, firstly, the east-west movements along Hoddle Street. So make pedestrian mobility along Hoddle Street a lot easier. And that may be through either widening of footpaths or new footpaths on the northern side of the road, for example, but then to have a number of really defined crossing points. And it's unlikely that they'll be signalised intersections. It may be that, for example, on this intersection here where we have Moonacres and the church, that we have really large build outs to reduce the distance that you need to cross, but also to really slow cars down. So it's relatively flat at that point. So if we were to build out to where the bike lane is, one, it would naturally slow cars down because the road really narrows through this area, but it also significantly reduces the distance that needs to be crossed. So we were looking at different design solutions that we can deliver that. At the moment, we are, I guess, still at this principle level about having these improved crossing points of Hoddle Street, and that Transport for New South Wales are supportive of that, but we will need to work through a process with them about exactly what those design solutions might be. But definitely we want improved east-west mobility along Hoddle Street, and then a number of defined crossing points to get people safely across Hoddle Street. We're also looking at improving access and mobility back into the centre. So along some of these key collector roads, looking at how we can make that easier and safer for people to move. Another thing that we're looking at in terms of movement is also, if you can see the green dotted line, having an active transport network throughout the centre, throughout the whole of the village, for a number of reasons. One, to improve mobility, but also we spoke earlier about the crossover of some of these design solutions between the different themes, and this active transport network probably ticks off most of those themes, certainly from an environment sustainability perspective, about reducing car dependency and providing access back into the centre, certainly from a community perspective. So the idea with this network, this active transport network, is about linking up a lot of the existing assets that you have in the village. So you've got the sports fields in the middle of town, there's an established riparian area with parts of public open space that are significantly underutilized, as well as even down near the train line, you have this really nice piece of open space that's significantly underutilized. So this is about providing an active transport loop that links all of these things together. And starting to build that sense of community through bringing people into these spaces. We're also looking at a number of things, whether we can start to look at whether it's an improved pedestrian crossing across the creek. Just to start to remove that barrier that the creek is currently a significant barrier to mobility, and whether there's easier ways of rather than everyone having to come back out to the highway, back up Hoddle Street, and then can put back up one of the other streets to get what is 100 metres from where they started, looking at how we can actually improve mobility through these areas. So in terms of environment sustainability, and this is probably a good example where a lot of the actions in the environment sustainability section won't be shown spatially. There'll be a lot of actions but possibly a lot, not as many shown spatially. But we're looking at this concept of that blue and green grid. Again, if you go back to, when I've got it on this slide, not only about a blue and green grid and the role that these areas play, both from a biodiversity or a hydrological perspective or an environmental perspective, but also the role that it can play in terms of an active transport network or a network of connected open space areas. It can be really significant assets for the community that we can link up through a plan like this. So in terms of housing, looking at, and again, I'll probably need to qualify a lot of this stuff to say we still haven't tested these sites yet, the same as we haven't tested some of the other things that we've shown yet. But these are our initial thoughts in terms of where we can start to look at providing a better diversity of housing types. You'll see the areas are located close to the centre, easy walking distance into the centre. So the sorts of areas where we want to provide smaller housing options. Again, I just really need to qualify that we haven't done enough detailed analysis to know which ones of these sites will work properly, because we want to, it's really important that we're not just providing additional housing, we're doing it in a way that's in keeping with the character of Robertson, and that's come through loud and clear through the consultation we've done to date. It's not just about housing for the sake of housing, it's housing that meets the needs of the community, but also contributes to and enhances the character of the village. And then looking at the village centre, what we're sort of starting to piece together for the village centre is there are some defined precincts. So there again, there's this established civic precinct. There is this existing community and social precinct with the sports fields and the skate park and the CTC and the like. There's also somewhat almost an established or partially established high street precinct, like a traditional main street area within Robertson. And what we're looking at is whether or not we can reinforce this area through both built form, as well as how we're addressing the street, how we manage the setbacks. Can we create more of a defined high street area or a main street area for the village? So in this area, we're looking at, so the blue line, I guess, indicates an active street edge. So that's that fine grain active edges, whether it's outdoor dining or your sort of fine grain retail, where we're creating that main street feel. It also means a zero setback. So there's a number of these buildings along that street are already built to the street edge. There are some that are set back and you lose that continuation of the street edge along the street. So if and when some of these sites redevelop, what we're saying is we'd like them to come up to the street and present as that sort of continuous main street, and to start to establish this area and picking up on the point I think Mark made earlier, whether or not that extends down as far as, for example, the tractor shop, because it is currently vacant, and whether we want it to be part of this sort of main street precinct. It does have this really strong connection through to that community and social precinct. It's not stretching the main street the whole way along, but starting to define that focal point for the centre. The other thing that we are wanting to start to test in terms of built form is, and hatching doesn't show up overly well in this area, but whether we also start to use building heights to define the focal point. As we showed earlier, there are a number of two-story buildings through this area already, and whether we want to reinforce the focal point by having an area that actually allows for two-story buildings. If you go to a lot of your country towns and villages, often the main street is that sort of two-story character, and then as you get out into the residential areas, it drops back to single stories. So should we be looking at using building heights and how the buildings address the street as a way to create that defined focal point for the centre? In terms of the area to, I was hoping to have time to get some photos to explain this idea better, but the area where the doctor's surgery is at the moment, and from the gallery through to the church and some of this residential stuff on the southern side of the Hoddle Street, we're looking at potentially what we're calling a mixed use precinct with adaptable frontages. So in this area, we really want to reinforce that character. So along the northern side of the street, there is a number of sort of really narrow, fine grain type frontages as it stands, and whether we can start to fill in some of the missing teeth, for want of a better word, fill in some of these blanks to create that better framed street, so that we have that really sort of framed, defined street edge. And some of those, a lot of that infill development, for want of a better word, would likely be residential development, but with an adaptable frontage. So we're creating, not only are we creating a really a smaller housing product right in close to the centre, so we're meeting a housing need of the community. There's a chance to actually enhance the character of this area by creating a more defined street edge and a more continuous street edge. And then a lot of those residential dwellings that might be inserted in between some of these existing buildings might have an opportunity to have, whether it's a small office at the front, or picking up on some of those things like the arts and cultural, or those artists and industries, they might be selling goods from the front, so it presents as a shop front at the front of the building, but it is actually a residential building at the back. So we want to start to look at some of those ideas about how we can tick off a number of things that we're trying to achieve, whether it's smaller housing, a better street edge, and hopefully an improved character of the centre. And really trying to look at, for example, these gateways into the village. I mean, at the moment, coming from the east heading west along Hoddle Street, there is this really nice entrance into Robertson. You come through the natural areas and with these long distance views to the rural landscape, go past the cheese factory building, and then you come in through this area that is a fairly defined part of the centre with this long distance view along Hoddle Street. And it's actually a really nice entrance into the street. We want to see whether on the western entrance of the street, whether we can try to enhance the current gateway. So at the moment you come in and there's a bit of a mishmash of setbacks. So the buildings are all set back different distances along that street. And one of the first things you see is the service station. So whether there's a way that we can improve this gateway and this entrance into the village. And ultimately what we want to look at for the centre is, as you said, creating this really defined focal point where we have this really main street part of the centre, looking at whether there's opportunities for this bit of open space for that village square. Again, reinforcing this area here as the village centre, to have a village square in that bit of Crown land that currently sits beside the CTC, as well as looking at whether there are some potential catalyst sites, and we've just picked up on some of the sites that are vacant at the moment, or and this is the tractor shop, whether or not it is a potential catalyst site. But we want to make sure that if this is a catalyst site, that we get the planning controls right to deliver a good outcome and not something that detracts from the centre, as well as looking at things like gateway treatment. So through, as we spoke about, this current, as you come into town, it is a really nice entrance into town, but whether we can enhance that through appropriate landscaping or signage in these little bits of public open space to really reinforce the character of Robertson as you're entering it. And yeah, it can have a significant impact over people's perception of a place and on what the gateway sites are like. And then in terms of communities and place, trying to reinforce Again, this will be another one where a lot of the actions in the place plan won't be spatial, but trying to reinforce that sense of identity, that sense of community, and that sense of place. So that's looking at the character. So we spoke earlier about the contributory buildings and the contributory landscaped areas, and looking at how we can protect and enhance those. Looking at, and this is an example I tried to sort of briefly touched on earlier, about how we can tell the story of the history of Robertson. There is some there's this area here where there is that bit of a history of Robertson, and that the plaques that exist next to the sports fields, but whether or not there's an opportunity along this frontage of the park here, I know there's sort of a pedestrian desire line there, and likely that we'll at some point put a pedestrian footpath along this side of the street. Whether as part of that, for example, whether we can have this sort of storytelling along the footpath, so it's not just a functional piece of infrastructure to improve movement, whether we can use these sorts of infrastructure upgrades to, for example, tell the story of the place, so tell the history of this place and provide that connection back to the history of this area. So we really want to explore so when we start to get into designing the actual infrastructure, how we can incorporate some of these things to reinforce that sense of place. But you also want to build on things like this the street library that sits out in the front of the old bank building. I mean, these sort of community-led initiatives that contribute to that sense of community, and how the community can deliver some of those things, and how council can facilitate them. So, does anyone want to jump in with questions now, or do you want me to quickly show you sort of what that looks like overall as a sort of overall plan for the village, and then jump into some questions? That's 5 seconds. Okay, so again, this is not just about those plans. It's not just about a village. This is about reflecting what the community have told us through the consultation to develop that vision, and also to start to set a number of planning principles or planning priorities based on what the community have told us, to develop this sort of overall place plan for Robertson. This is starting to bring together a lot of these concepts onto one plan. So looking at whether we can bring the riparian areas back into public ownership, or whether they can play a role as part of this green corridor, this green and blue corridor, both from again, a hydrological and biodiversity values, but also as a public asset for access and movement, and for recreation, and whether there's this opportunity to link some of these existing assets and improve some of these existing assets, but link them through this network of active transport infrastructure. Again, we spoke, I guess, structurally about improved east-west mobility and this better access into the centre. The one thing I probably didn't mention earlier, but I will mention now quickly, we're also exploring opportunities to use some of these existing laneway infrastructure, either for access, parking, or servicing. Some of them, it's certainly not as easy as it looks. Some of them are quite narrow and tricky, but we're exploring whether or not we can use those laneways for either access or servicing. And then looking at where we put land uses and housing diversity around some of these structural changes, and looking at whether, for example, we can use development to deliver some of these outcomes. So, for example, this riparian area, is there an opportunity to allow smaller lot residential developments around it? And this example below is just an example. We would want something that is more specific to that Robertson character, but it is a good example of really small lots. So these are 300 metre squared lots. Certainly not a bad character. They're developed quite sensitively. And can we, by allowing additional development in these areas, bring that riparian area back into public ownership as part of a public open space network? And can we then activate the edge of that by having houses front out over this to provide that passive surveillance, so to make sure that this is a safe place for people to use and not back fences, like 6-foot colour-bond fences along the edge. This is actually a place that people can see and use. And then looking again how we can deliver multiple how we can deliver on multiple of these objectives through new development. So a good example is this area where we can potentially improve the gateway and that entrance into town. We can provide a housing product that is needed, appropriately located in close to the centre, as well as having a better defined street edge and hopefully an enhanced character for that part of the street. And even on, for example, these vacant sites, whether we can start to create a more attractive entrance into town without, I guess, the first thing you see being the service station. And there are ways of, you could allow this site to be developed and end up with a really poor outcome if you ended up with, again, colour-bond fences along the back, and the last thing we want to be doing is driving in and the first thing you look at is 6-foot colour-bond fences. But there are ways of treating back fences, for example, and this is a development not far from where I live, where this is the back of the buildings, but it provides that attractive rear of the building that actually presents as if it is the front of the buildings, but these are the rear of the buildings. So there's ways that you can put design controls in place to ensure that you're delivering not only a housing product that's needed, but hopefully a better entrance into the village. And then this is just starting to piece together some of the puzzles. So looking at those existing areas, those more defined focal point, better movement throughout the centre, and then looking at where additional and that smaller lot housing might sit around the village. And I think that's it. So I'm going to leave it on that screen. And then I'm going to open up for questions.
I think we have Timothy first.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I was just interested in the bringing of the buildings forward to the street and all that sort of thing. I mean, at the moment, there's a bit of parking on the street curbs before the buildings, and a lot of those nice country towns you see have, rear to the curb parking so they can fit more cars in. Well, that's not going to happen in Robertson, I wouldn't imagine, on the highway. So whereabouts do you think, if the buildings are pulled forward, like the supermarket and whatever, where do you envisage that the parking might be able to be accommodated? So that, I mean, I don't like driving down a street looking at a whole lot of parked cars either, but they've got to park somewhere. Yeah. Especially around the supermarket, where people need to be able to get things in and out of their car,
Yeah, the supermarket's a really good example where you need to have parking on the site and it needs to be easily accessible. But that's where we're going to explore the use of, for example, that where the supermarket currently exists, there is a laneway that at the rear of the supermarket. We need to do a lot more detailed analysis as to whether we could make that work from access. So the supermarket could come towards the street, so be built up towards the street with the parking coming out off that laneway. A really good example of a really good supermarket in a village centre that presents to the street and contributes to the character of the street. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the IGA in Jamberoo. It really contributes to the character of the street, but is also really functional. So the parking.
Yeah, but there's no parking. There's a couple of problems with that. Is number one, there's no parking, and number two is, and this would be illegal, but I don't think the Windsor Caribou would wear it, is that when they get a delivery, because I used to live in Jamberoo, the delivery truck pulls up out the front, dumps all their goods on the footpath, and that sits the pallet. They bring it inside, which I don't think that you'd be allowed to get away with that.
No, and that's why we want to explore that
Yeah.
parking and servicing to occur from the rear. Look, you can do things like timed servicing as well. So you can have servicing only before 7 o'clock in the morning, for example, and have a clear way out the front of the supermarket for that between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., for example, to allow the servicing to occur or the deliveries to occur. That's what we don't want to do, is be hamstrung to say, well, we have to have parking at the front. Like, I'd rather work around solutions in terms of, okay, how can we deliver this outcome, rather than say, well,
because the pub's the same. The pub, the pub car park is probably the greatest waste of prime real estate in the town. I mean, that would be nice to have buildings there, but you'd have to, they need that car park because a lot of people, it's often full. So, it would be nice. It would be nice that the pub car park wasn't the centre of town too.
No, that's right. And it's one of the sites that we flagged earlier as is it a potential catalyst site. It's a vacant site on the prominent corner in the centre of town. But certainly you would have to look at what they do with parking, and look, that is a significant size car park, but it's also significantly inefficient in terms of its layout. It doesn't. If you had a marked car park in there, you could get a lot more car parking spaces than what they have when it's not marked. So there are opportunities to do that, but certainly we'd need to go through a more site-specific analysis for some of those things, the supermarket, that vacant bit of land next to the pub.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Tim. Got Atul Joshi's hand up as well. Atul, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that presentation. It's you talked a lot. Thank you for talking so much and going through everything. Two specific questions. My reception to it is really positive. I think lots of things in it seem really great, particularly the opening up of the riparian zones, which I, as a resident, don't access very much and would be really interested in opening up a lot more. And a lot of what you said about gateways and about high streets made a lot of sense to me and sort of reflected my own thinking. Two questions around the movement, particularly on Hoddle Street. Apart from those physical features that you've described, I think one of the big impediments is the speed that people use that street at, and whether there were any other things that could be considered to ensure people kept to 50 kilometres an hour. And secondly, your thoughts around what the potential active transport loop actually looks like. I wasn't sure, are you thinking of a shuttle service or just a access corridor that people could bike along, or I wasn't quite clear on what that meant.
Yep. Okay. Already forgotten the first. Oh no, the speed of traffic. I'm going to assume when you said I talk a lot, that's a good thing. I'm sure everyone else thinks it's a bad thing. I know I get sick of hearing my own voice, so I'll apologise and I'll try to get through it quickly. But the traffic and the speed of the traffic along Hoddle Street is something that we're looking at really closely, because what we want to do, and it's part of that creating that high street feel too, is about changing the priority in the street to give pedestrians more priority. It's never going to be a pedestrian dominated street. It is the highway. It plays a really important function as a transport corridor, but how can we shift that to make it a better place to spend time, where cars are traveling slower. There are a couple of things that we're looking at. So I spoke earlier about looking at, for example, that intersection treatment. So try to achieve a number of goals with one. So not just saying, okay, well, let's build out and have a pedestrian crossing at this point. It might be that at the key intersection at Moonacres here, if all four corners were built right out towards the bike lane, so you're significantly reducing the width of the road. We could also look at doing the same. This is part of the discussion we've had with the Transport for New South Wales. Also have the same treatment at the IGA, for example, and potentially down here at Pizzas in the Mist. So instead of seeing this long, straight, really wide road, and people's natural reaction when you see a long, straight, really wide road is to put your foot on the accelerator and drive faster, can we use design solutions to slow cars down? And we're not ever going to get Transport New South Wales to agree to putting speed humps in the centre, and I don't think you need to, but these other types of design solutions. So it might be, for example, a central median, a landscape central median, again, contributes to the character, slows cars down, has a spot where people can stop when they're crossing the road halfway, so it's an easier process to cross the road. We're not at that design solution stage. We need to work through that closely with Transport for New South Wales. Ultimately, they will need to sign off on any of those sorts of solutions. But the real positive is that they were receptive to all of those ideas. Traditionally, Transport for New South Wales were focused on how long it takes a car to get from point A to point B, and anything that disrupted that was bad. But they've shifted their thinking to looking more at places as places. So they were really receptive to the idea of trying to slow cars down and make it a safer place for pedestrians. The second one, in terms of the active transport link, that loop, for want of a better word, certainly not shuttles, but whether it is a formal shared way or so for bikes and pedestrians. I don't know whether, look, it is a discussion I'm going to have a bit of a wrestle with our assets team about how we deliver some of these things with fairly limited resources. But it is about a pedestrian and cycle network, to provide that sort of connection between these areas.
Thanks for those questions. I think next is Mark.
Oh, thank you. I'll try and be quick. Two things. The village building form, I think, is very important to retain what the community desires. And that's a friendly town that's pleasant to come into and to look at. I'm just wondering whether the current DCP is flexible enough to allow those sorts of diverse building forms that probably would be desired. Often you'll see in different communities the same thing goes up because the DCP mandates certain colours or mandates certain roof shapes, and there isn't enough flexibility to allow the things you're talking about. Is the DCP going to be a problem, do you think? Or interpretation of the DCP going to be a problem? Can I just raise the second one quickly so I don't have to bore with your body again? The railway line is a colour-bond fence in itself in many ways. It sort of divides the community in half. And the whole of this concept backs onto this railway line. And some of the crossings leave a lot to be desired, particularly the one going from Moonacres across to the southern side of the town. There's no footpath going up to that crossing, and there's no footpath on the other side. And there's a verge that slopes down a good 1.5 meters on either side, and it's quite dangerous. I'm just wondering whether the railway people are cooperating with the council on some of these plans.
Look, well, the first question I'll answer really quickly because it's an easy one in terms of the DCP. Does it currently facilitate what we're showing on these plans? I'm going to say no, and what will be a clear sort of action out of these plans is an amendment to Council's planning framework to facilitate it. And that will be both the LEP and DCP. What is really important, though, is that those amendments are carefully thought out and will deliver the outcome that we're saying at a strategic level, because getting that framework right is the real challenge, and making sure the mechanisms to make sure we have enough flexibility but also enough control that we can say no to bad things is really important. But that is one of the things that will be my team's responsibility coming out of this. But as I said, there will also be a lot of things that we'll hand back over to the community and to the industry to drive. Improving access across the train line. At the moment, we are very much at that principle level where we clearly see a need for improved access. We do need to have conversations with not TAHI, ARTC, about as the rail corridor owner, about how we can improve some of these access options. as well as looking at speaking with our capital works guys and our asset team about how we can fund and deliver some of these things. But as a principle, it's certainly something that we are wanting to see. It's come through the consultation, it's come through the analysis. So it's something that we would like to deliver. It's just as we start to get into this implementation side of things and looking at budgets and things like that is where we'll have to start to look at prioritising some of these works as well.
Thanks, Michael. Glad the DCP is going to be addressed. I think that's important.
Thanks for that, Mark. We've got Jenny next for the question as well.
Oh, hi, Michael, Garama, everybody. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. How are you, Jenny?
You're right.
Very well, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really excited to see the possibility of some kind of pedestrian crossing across the street near where the CTC is. Just those red arrows I guess the question is what kind of pedestrian crossing is that? But I think, you know, one of the big barriers to people using the CTC is the fact we don't have a footpath on that side of the road, and pedestrian access is difficult. We've got some really good community assets there, the CTC, the men's shed, maybe Karen, the op shop might even get there one day, plus that vacant land with the possibility of some kind of community square. We've also been talking to the library. We'd love the mobile library to be able to stop there, for example, as well. So just really supporting the idea of pedestrian access at that point, and the possibilities of footpaths across on that side of the street. But maybe if you could just talk a bit more about what the pedestrian access is that you're looking at there. Thank you.
Yep. Look, I'll touch on both things. Certainly that east-west movement of pedestrians along Hoddle Street is critically important, and I guess the elephant in the room is, are council going to go and build this infrastructure now? Look, what we want to use this plan as is a way to feed back up through council's capital works planning. So we want to identify some of this real priority infrastructure, and certainly the analysis that we've done to date shows that footpath on the northern side of Hoddle Street, running from the church to the Peaches in the Mists, like along the whole past the CTC and along the sports field, is a real missing link. And for me, it's certainly coming out as a priority piece of infrastructure. So we want to use this plan as a way to feed back up through the budgeting process at council, as well as to do things like try to attract grant funding, because we see that as a really critical piece of infrastructure. And then in terms of those defined crossing points, that's what I mentioned earlier about we have some ideas, and whether they are what they call build outs, where you actually bring the footpath right out into, so you take away part of the area that's designated for parking to reduce the distance that you're crossing. And so that way you're slowing cars down and reducing the distance, or it might be through a centralized medium. So there's actually a separate area, might be a landscape medium where you can actually stop, a pedestrian refuge they're often called, where you can stop halfway across, and it will not only slow cars down but provides a chance that you can cross halfway, stop, and then wait for the traffic on the other side and cross the other half. We do need to work through what those solutions will be with Transport for New South Wales, because they it's easy for me to say we'll do all these things, but they need to sign off on them. But the good thing is that they're really supportive of the concept of improving these crossing points. It's just getting a design that works for both the community and for Transport for New South Wales.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Jenny. I think next is Karen.
Unmute. There we go. Oh, are you in? Am I in?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you, Karen.
Oh, right, fine. The whole concept is so exciting. to look at, and it makes so much sense. It's been an enormous amount of work and is looking wonderful. I live on the north side, which of this whole thing, so to have some pedestrian access around back and forwards and up to High Street and so on would be an absolute blessing. What's of interest to me is what it would be like to live on the south side of the railway line, which at this stage doesn't appear to have had the same sort of detailed planning. I'm very aware of how difficult it is to get along South Street. We've got kids and women with prams and mobility scooters and the whole lot trying to navigate a narrow strip of tar with rough edges at the moment. And there's also unofficial crossing points over the railway line, very well defined, very well known to the locals, because the whole inconvenience and difficulty of making your way to either end to get across the railway line, particularly the difficulties with Marilla Street, as Mark had pointed out, with the steep verges and the completely unmade pathway, even in the main part of the town. You wouldn't consider walking all the way along South Street to cross at Marilla Street because it's no better than the unofficial pathway that they've created through the bush and over the line. So I'm just wondering when and where that part of the town is being considered.
Yep, good question. Look, it has certainly been considered. Like some of the other areas, we haven't shown a change in terms of, say, look at all the areas to the north of the village, for example, that are further away from the centre. We haven't shown a change to try to have additional housing, for example, largely because of that reason you just spoke about. It is really disconnected by a physical barrier that's not going anywhere. I'd love to be able to say we're going to put a pedestrian bridge over the rail line, but we don't want to set unrealistic expectations about what council can and can't deliver. So there always is going to be this real physical barrier. We have flagged through one of the earlier plans that sort of desire to improve access from this side back into the centre. But it will be around improving access through this area, not about a new crossing over the rail line. It'll be about improving what currently exists. And that may include, as you said, improve sort of pedestrian safety along South Street, whether that's through formal infrastructure or widening of verges or whatever it might be. I don't know. We haven't got into that detail, but certainly that the concept of improving access from the southern part of the village back into the centre is something that's been flagged, flagged through the analysis.
Okay. Thank you. Good work.
Thanks, Karen. We've got David, who also has a question as well.
Yeah, is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Right. Look, I've lived in Robertson for over 20 years, and I quite like it the way it is. Actually, I'm not to say that all the effort you put in, it's a worthwhile thing you've done, and for the future, it gives quite a good ideas of incremental improvement. But fundamentally, it all comes down to budget and money to make these things work. And in my view at the moment, there's more important things to spend money on than a lot of the things you've got. You've got it because the infrastructure of Robertson is getting worse. I would say money has to be spent on fixing all the potholes. Admittedly, this rainfall event we're having has caused a lot of these. And B, fixing the community centre so we can use it again. This building has just been allowed to decay and dilapidate over this period of COVID pandemic, where it's no longer usable. Now, you would expect a community centre to be the centre of the community, but it's not even usable. So it does come down to a budget. But on the good side, you've given us a lot of food for thought here. I certainly like the idea of having a walkway along the Carlong Creek. And perhaps you could give some thought to how to safely do U-turns in the Illawarra Highway. Everybody does it. And so far, the traffic is not so bad that you can't do it. But if it gets worse, it's going to be a problem. So pedestrian crossings, yes, is good. But then anyway, they're the thoughts that come to mind.
No, it's a good point because looking at sort of community infrastructure is sort of all part of this place planning exercise. What I'll say just quickly, you may or may not be aware, there's another body of work that's being done across the whole Shire by council, which is looking at exactly that, about community buildings, sports fields and things, looking at what we currently have, what we need in the future and how we get from point A to point B. So as part of that, they will make specific recommendations for each town and village. So there is likely going to come out of that body of work, and that's been through fairly recent consultation with the community. And it will likely make specific recommendations about what's needed in Robertson, and will again directly feed back into that budgetary process. We will also pick up what it says in terms of what's needed in Robertson and try and reflect it in this body of work, but it will directly inform council's sort of forward planning in terms of what infrastructure upgrades are required. So, and look, I don't know enough about the community centre itself in Robertson to sort of say what state it's in.
I noticed you've got all these sort of pictures all over your diagrams about things, and there's that little block of buildings there, which I'm going to tell you that half the community centre is still usable for the preschool, and it's a very important role that it does and continues to have. But there's a lovely hall there that's been allowed to become fall into decay, and it needs to be fixed. And maintaining the infrastructure. I mean, here we're the old dilemma between the important and the urgent. Well, there's urgent stuff to do.
Yep. No, and look, I don't disagree in terms of certainly council have, I don't know how much you follow council business, but they've just in the process of committing a significant increase in funding for fixing roads and potholes, because it is in every town and village we go to, it's a significant issue, and it is a challenge for us. We have a lot of road per head of population, but it's a significant concern for the community, and you'll see in the budget that comes out shortly a significant increase in spending on fixing infrastructure and on fixing roads. Look, I don't know about the community facility itself, but I know that they are doing this body of work, which will allow them to then prioritise spending, because again, limited amount of money, a lot of facilities, this will be about directing it to the things that are most needed, and which may well come, and again, I don't want to preempt what that study says, it may well come in and say throw a lot of money at the Robertson Community Centre. And whatever it does say, we'll start to reflect that in this body of work as well.
Okay, anyway, don't let me put you off. Keep what you do.
No, it's good. It's good. We certainly welcome all the feedback.
No, just a silly old bugger.
No, same. That's what everyone says about me.
That's everyone that has put their hand up. Is there anyone else that has any other questions or comments?
Okay, well, 5-second rule. Just very quickly in terms of where to from here. What we'll do is, again, we were hoping that we could come out and meet face to face today. We will now try to organise a session as soon as possible and start to get into detail about filling in the blanks. So we've started to see our initial ideas, but starting to look at what actions might sit underneath each of these different themes, and as well as implementation and who will take ownership over some of these ideas and bring them to reality. There are some practical realities, again, that we made some good points a second ago about council. The practical realities about council has a limited budget. Every town and village wants significant upgrades to occur, but we need to then look at how we can prioritize that, but also look at alternate means to deliver some of these upgrades. So we want to use this plan as a mechanism to, one, start to feed back up through council's budgeting process so we can set clear priorities for the village, but also look at alternate ways we can fund things. So whether that is through using this plan as a tool to go for grant funding, for example, or whether upgrades that can be led and delivered by the community or by the industry, or as we mentioned earlier with this area about bringing this back into public ownership, whether we can deliver that by allowing development to occur on the edges of this riparian area to bring that back into public ownership. There might also be opportunities for the community to take ownership of certain things. A good example might be we have this areas of public open space here that are significantly underutilized, significantly overgrown with lantana and the like, and whether there's opportunities for things like a land care group to come in and try to clean up some of these areas to make it a more usable public space and an asset for the local community. So the next stage as we come out to speak to the community will be about starting to look at what the actions are and how we can deliver on some of these actions. So that's enough talking from me. I'm sure everyone's got better things to do at this time of night than listen to me talk. So thank you everyone for coming. We really value everyone's input into the project so far. And hopefully we will see you when we come back out to Robertson very shortly.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks everyone.